Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and in this one, we're going to be talking about the Son of Rogue. Before we get into it, though, make sure you smash that like button, check to see if you're still subscribed, and as always, leave us a comment. We've got an awesome community here, and it's all thanks to you guys. So thank you so much for being here. With all that said, let's dive in. So, for people who follow the podcast, you may remember some previous adventures where we mentioned John Redbridge. He met Rogue in Mississippi around the same time that the first Dukes of Hazzard episode would have aired on TV. So, probably 1979 roundabout. And for whatever reason, we had decided to rip off Dukes of Hazzard a lot with Rogue's origin story. So we were kind of taking a lot of concepts from Daisy Duke and infusing it into our version of Rogue. So, for instance, while she was still living in the Deep South, she was a bartender at a place called Book's Bar. And she lived with her aunt, Carrie. And then in our version of the game, we gave Carrie a couple of sons named John and Tom that were Rogue's cousins, who are not characters that exist in the game. But at any rate, the sort of the big takeaway from that adventure was that Rogue got pregnant, right? And so a lot of people over the years have wondered why though? Like why did you do that to Rogue so early in the timeline? And this character is why. When we introduced him in, I think it was 1996, the way it worked out was he would have been born in 1980. So that's why we did it that way. Um, I was a huge fan of Rogue from the X-Men cartoon that was still on the air, by the way, when we were playing these adventures. And I was really, really into everything she had going on. I wanted to make a character of my own to play, and so I connected the two. Instead of just making a knockoff of Rogue, we decided to actually make it her son without really giving too much thought to the timeline when we did it. And then after we named him Matrix, by the way, after he had been around for a while, and his alter ego, by the way, is Chris D'Ancanto, which is Rogue's last name in some continuities. It kind of varies from continuity to continuity. In our game, she is Anna Marie D'Ancanto, so then her son is Chris D'Ancanto. But yeah, his superhero name is Matrix, and again, that comes from me being a Transformers fan. The matrix of leadership contained all the wisdom of every leader of the Autobots, through all of history. And so my concept with this character was I wanted him to eventually contain every superpower. That as he would go on these adventures, he would basically every adventure he would pick up another power. Um, and so the big thing that he did at this point in our timeline, he's done a lot of stuff over the years, and he's actually a pretty big deal in our game world. And now my son plays him, and he in the modern day is almost like a Dr. Manhattan level character because of all these powers he's picked up along the way. One of the other things I should probably mention since we're talking about powers is his deal was kind of like we've mentioned before, where like Superman will have a kid, and then oftentimes the kid is only half as powerful as the dad. But then the flip side of that coin is then kryptonite does not hurt the kid as much, right? Like he feels sick and kind of nauseous when it's around, but he can keep going more than his dad could because some of Superman's kids are half human with Lois Lane, right? So you get the idea. So we kind of applied that concept, generally speaking, to Rogue. And we were like, well, what if her son didn't have like all of her disadvantages like full blown like the mom does, right? And so specifically the thing about being able to touch people and stuff like that, we ended up saying that Matrix could touch people, that the chances of him absorbing powers were less than the chances of her mom being able to do it. Excuse me, I meant to say his mom. But you get the idea. So that was the other thing, was he didn't have as much of her, what would be the word? Boy, I don't quite know what to call it, but you know how Rogue has all these negative feelings because she just wants to be held and it's not happening and so on and so forth. We didn't really do that with him. With him, he just was kind of more okay. And the other thing was he pretty quickly, because in DC Heroes, you can buy a connection to kind of anybody you want. And we see on certain character sheets where someone will just have a connection to something like Earth's mystical community, will be a phrase, right? And so that literally means that character kind of knows everybody with magical powers of some sort, right? So that's a pretty big catch-all, right? So we gave Matrix a low-level connection after we'd played him for a little while to Earth's superhero community. So he kind of knew everybody. And then that meant, if he knows somebody like Professor X, Professor X can help him if he has some kind of a mental issue. If he knows somebody like Doctor Strange or Doctor Fate or whatever, they can help him with the stuff that they specialize in, so on and so forth. So we thought he was different than his mom, and we liked it. We thought it was a cool way to do it. And then the other thing was because he kind of knew all the superheroes. It's sort of like how in the early Marvel Cinematic Universe they were using Nick Fury, right? Where he would show up at the end of a movie and he would say something like, "I want to talk to you about the Avengers Initiative," stuff like that. We were doing a very similar concept, but what we were doing was everybody was making their own original characters. Most of them had no connection at all to either Marvel or DC. So, for instance, a friend of mine named David Allier, he made a character named Archer, who was actually an elf. The idea was he had actually come from kind of a fantasy world. That's because David himself was more of a D&D player, a little bit new to the comic book genre in a way. So he basically, came to Earth through some kind of a portal from elsewhere. So he was an elven archer, in kind of a D&D sense. But then also, the way we were treating him as a superhero was he was inspired by other characters like Green Arrow and Hawkeye, where he had like trick arrows and stuff like that. Another character on the team, we had a Green Lantern, actually, one of the few nods to the existing stuff. Um, Played by Heather Searfoss. She was pretty cool. I'm trying to think who else would have been on that team. Jeremy was playing a character named Smolder who had fire powers. He was bald. When he would kind of like flame on, the idea was he was burning off the hair off of his body. The hair was not immune to the fire, but his basically everything else was. So Smolder was like perpetually bald. Um, there was a guy named John Ludhart who played a character named Ripper, who I would compare kind of to X-23, the daughter of Wolverine. Um, Boy. Oh, and Polar. I should really talk about Polar. There was a fighting game, and let me know in the comments because some of you are probably going to know exactly what game I'm thinking of, and I cannot remember the name of it now. I think the character's name in this 90s fighting game might have been like Glacius, something like that. And he was an ice guy. He was like an ice golem. And so Howard, we were going to arcades and everything back then, and he was playing this game and he loved that ice guy. So he made a rip off of that guy named Polar. And we were doing this in GURPS Supers. And GURPS has a power called resurrection. And then there's another power called regrowth. And so resurrection, I think, is self-explanatory. If your character dies, they get better. They come back from the dead. It's one of their powers. Um, and then regrowth is if someone were to cut off your arm, you grow a new arm, right? And then regeneration. He had tons of regeneration. So he's a very tough guy. And on top of that, he had a good bit of super strength. And, the fact his body was made of ice meant it was resistant to damage. So if a normal street level goon were to punch him with his bare hand, that guy probably is just getting a broken hand. So Polar was very tough. In order to afford all of those abilities, though, because it's a point purchase system, right? So you only get so many points to build your character on. In order to afford all of that, Howard decided to take like just a ton of disadvantages. And I can't even remember now what all the disadvantages were, but part of it was he had like a bad temper. So if you got on Polar's bad side, he'll just punch you full bore, not hold back at all. And like I said, he's got super strength. And so there gets to be this point in the game where because the whole team was called the New Continuum. I can't remember if I already mentioned that or not. But they had a building downtown in the city where these adventures took place. And there was another member of the team called the Invincible Kid. And he was played by Jason Seidner. And then his thing was he was completely immune to damage. GURPS had this advantage called invulnerability to all kinetic damage. And so basically, all the points you get to make your character, it all goes into that one advantage. So on the one hand, you cannot be, hurt at all. It was as if he were made of adamantium or something. On the other hand, though, he had no points left over for offensive abilities. So he was kind of an athletic guy, physically he would have stats that, on par with somebody like, say, a high school football player, right? Athletic, but he's certainly no Batman, right? But he was like completely immune to damage. And we did this adventure where they went to the negative universe. And we've mentioned that in some old videos where like Superman's counterpart was Ultraman, Batman's counterpart was Owlman, right? It's that world, which we call the negative universe or the Negaverse for short. So the heroes went there and they were in the local shopping mall, and this mall has been looted and pretty much destroyed, and it's in bad shape. And there were some bad guys in the mall, and at one point, the Invincible Kid picks up a camcorder because again, this is the mid '90s, right? He like he picks up a camcorder and turns it on, and he yells at this one villain, and the villain like turns around and looks at him, and the Invincible Kid throws this camcorder like a football where it spirals and it hits the villain in his face. And so I tell Seidner, roll the dice and see what you get. And he got a critical success. So it's this amazing throw, and it breaks this guy's nose, and then it breaks the camcorder, so the camcorder stops recording. And at any rate, they fight. They finish this guy off, and then Seidner takes the VCR tape out of the camcorder and he puts it in a pocket in his leather jacket. And by the time this whole adventure is over with, they come back to our normal dimension that the game takes place in. And he had that VCR tape as a souvenir. And so they put it in the VCR in their headquarters and they watch the tape. And most of these guys are like 16-year-old kids or something like that, had kind of like a Young Justice, Teen Titans kind of a vibe in a way. And they thought it was great. They were just really entertained at this, being able to watch the video of this guy getting hit in the face. Well, so everybody else kind of watches it and they get it out of their system and they go about their day or whatever. And Howard, I think, was just tired of playing Polar and wanted to play somebody else. So he made this guy named Thunderbird, and Howard is Native American. So Thunderbird was a Native American character that was kind of like a mashup of like Hawkman and Storm from the X-Men, right? So at any rate, though, because he didn't want to play Polar anymore, he just sort of said, Polar just keeps watching this tape. And Polar would watch it all the way through and then have this big kind of belly laugh and then like rewind it and just watch the tape again. And that's all Polar would do then. He was in the headquarters the whole time, just watching this tape on loop. And Howard thought that in and of itself was kind of funny. That he lost all interest in fighting crime and saving people and so on and so forth. The other thing that was going on is I forgot to mention around this time, Josh Boggs started playing a character named Barrage, who was very inspired by X-Men comics. He was like a martial artist with Magneto powers and stuff like that. And then his brother John Boggs was playing this guy named Hacker. And Hacker was a gadgeteer. And one of the rules in GURPS is your gadgets need to be maintained. For instance, you wouldn't be able to drive a car forever without ever changing the oil and expect the car to always work, right? You got to change the oil. You got to, trade out a tire every once in a while, things like that, right? Things break down. So they have this rule that basically, as I was running it anyways, said that the gadgeteer needs to just take a little bit of time, every game session to just, at the beginning of the game, for instance, I would ask characters, what are you doing? What do you want to be doing when the game starts? And they would often say stuff like, I want to be at the local arcade playing video games because I'm a young guy, blah, blah, blah. And maybe one of the other characters says, you know what, I'm like sitting on my couch watching horror movies, eating pizza. You go around everybody. But when you get to the gadgeteer, all I wanted him to do was basically say, I maintain my gear. And when I'm done with that, I go grab some pizza with the other guys or whatever, right? That's all I needed him to say. And I conveyed this to him. I'm like, you need to establish that you're taking care of your gear. And John would just absolutely refuse. And John's big claim to fame is his character had been a superhero in the Weird West, right? And I'm trying to remember his name back then. It was like Lightning Monroe or something. His last name was Monroe, and Eugene Monroe. And we found out he was actually an alien named Clayton, but he'd been on Earth and he was doing stuff in the Old West, and he had built this steampunk cloning device that we called a Genesis device. And so this thing's super old. It's been around since the Old West. And the way it is set up is it's a gadget with like the detect power. And he specified that what it detects is anytime he dies. So if something happens to one of the Monroes, right? It's all the same guy through the ages because they're all clones of the original guy. Whenever one of them dies, the machine detects this. It has his DNA on file, and it makes a fresh version of that character, right? And but like I said, he absolutely refused to ever maintain it. So after a while, I started to come up with these uh, defects that the clones would have, and he was becoming death prone. Like his character, I don't know. I feel like every 2 months or so, something would happen and his character would die. And so then the machine would try to make another one. And so I made a table for him to roll on of like random character defects. Like, yes, it clones you, but you have no eyebrows. Or yes, it clones you, but you have a sixth finger on your left hand. It was always it's breaking down. And so you'd be like, okay, John, do you want to like go change the oil in your 100-year-old cloning device? And he'd be like, nah. I'm good. Like, I don't need eyebrows. And I was like, okay. And so it just kept getting weirder and weirder. And one of them was a clone turned out female. And in this particular instance, the clone turned out and was a teenager. So since he had lightning powers, electrical abilities, he used the name Surge for this guy. And then he was on this team as well. And it drove me nuts because he was a gadgeteer who refused to invent anything. And like a sizable portion of his points on his character sheet were spent because I think cinematic gadgeteer costs like 50 points or something. That's like a really expensive advantage, right? And he's not doing anything with it at all. And I kept making adventures where the heroes would be in some sort of a situation where the smart guy should do smart guy things to get him out of a jam. And he would like just refuse every time. And it was frustrating me. And then we had a couple of other gadgeteers on the team. I'm trying to remember who those guys were. Like we had a guy named Manic who was played by Greg Sheets, and he was literally bipolar because Greg himself was bipolar. A lot of people were kind of putting themselves into the characters, you know what I mean? And so the way Greg was running it was kind of like when he's running at super speed, he's like really, really happy, right? And if he's standing still at the time, he's like really, really, really sad. But there was like no in betweens. But in addition to that, he was a gadgeteer who refused to make anything. Like all the gadgeteers we had refused to make anything, and it was driving me nuts. And so to try to get him to engage a little, I made an NPC and we just called him the smart monkey. And he literally was a little monkey with a long tail, and he was from a lab. And um the heroes rescue him from the lab, and they find out these guys were experimenting on him, almost like kind of a like the new Planet of the Apes movies in a way. And so now he's like really, really smart. And I made him a gadgeteer. And so he got his hands on I think it was a speak and spell, and he kind of rewired it and stuff, and he'd wear it around his neck on like kind of like a guitar strap kind of a thing. And then he would type on it when he wanted to talk to people because he didn't have the vocal cords to speak English, even though he understood English. Um, and he ended up becoming kind of the team gadgeteer, and he built a mech for himself so that he could do more damage in combat. And it was like it looked like a big robot gorilla, basically, but where the head should be was just like a glass dome. So you'd see the little monkey in there working joysticks and stuff, and you get the idea, right? And then the chest would lower and be a ramp, so the little monkey would skitter down the ramp, after he was done using the mech. And so you get the idea. At any rate, one day Howard was playing and wanted to revisit Polar again. And so he's playing Polar, and um he's monopolizing the TV in the headquarters. And so Smart Monkey comes in and is very nice and says something on his little speak and spell like, would it be okay if we watched something else for a change? You've been watching the same VCR tape of a guy getting hit in the face by a camcorder for like 6 months. Could we please change the channel? And Polar, with his bad temper, basically says, like, I will rip out your guts if you touch the remote control. And so Smart Monkey's like annoyed by this, like, well, I'm not going to put up with this guy being a jerk or whatever. And so he goes and gets in his mech that is the size of a gorilla, by the way. It's not like it's a kaiju or anything, it's just gorilla sized. And he comes back in and he changes the channel and he says, no, you're being a jerk. The rest of us want to watch TV too, da 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 da. And oh my God, it starts this fight. If you've ever seen Family Guy when Peter fights the chicken, and it's just this insane knockdown, drag out fight that just rages on and on and on, right? That's what this was. It was Polar versus Smart Monkey became the stuff of legends in our game where Polar just was so mad he changed the channel. He's just straight up going to kill the monkey. And Polar wasn't real into shooting freeze rays at you and stuff like that. I think he had that ability, but it was kind of weak. Polar instead would his thing was he would break off his pinky finger and put it in the freezer in an ice cube tray. And the way resurrection works in GURPS is as long as there's a little bit of you left somewhere, no matter what happens to the bigger portion of you, that little bit will grow into a new you. So Polar would break off his pinky finger, put it in the freezer, and then he would regrow a new pinky finger. And then when he died, those pinky fingers would grow into a new Polar. So, and he didn't really tell anybody who was doing it either. The other members of the team were not privy to this information. They didn't know how he was coming back. Um, and after a while, too, the more he was making people mad, um, the more they were looking for wherever his missing piece was. So he was hiding it in freezers elsewhere, you know? So at one point he had taken a ice machine from someplace and took it down in the sewer under the city and had found like an electrical outlet down there where he plugged it in, and he had pinky finger in that ice machine, for instance. So point being, um, they got in this massive fight, and then Smart Monkey would finally hit Polar, like melt him with flamethrowers and stuff built into the mech. So then that pinky finger would grow into a hand, and it would kind of Evil Dead its way out of the freezer and slither off somewhere to regrow into a full size Polar, which took like a few days. And he would go hide a pinky finger again and start the whole thing over again. And then like Smart Monkey would be watching something on TV, like Jerry Springer or whatever the Smart Monkey wanted to watch. And then Polar would come back in, fully intending to murder a teammate. But I can't mention this era and not mention that. I'm trying to think what else were we doing from here? I'm probably overlooking something massive. We had a really good game where they fought Lex Luthor of all people, and it was Lex Luthor Senior. Um, and he was getting really old, and so he had. I just completely ripped off an episode of Batman the Animated Series where they have a guy. I want to say his name is Grant Walker. It was a none too subtle reference to Walt Disney. Really, the plot is pretty much Walt Disney kidnaps Mr. Freeze because Walt Disney wants to become Disney on Ice, because he's not going to live forever either. And it was a nod to, I don't know if you want to call it an old wives' tale or a conspiracy theory or whatever, but there's this theory that, Walt Disney was frozen, before he died and stuff. And so that's like what they were referencing. And in the episode, they have kind of an analog for Epcot, which if you get a minute sometime, check out like Walt Disney's original plans for Epcot. It's actually a little creepy. Where it wasn't going to be a theme park. It was going to be like the city of the future, but he had some really strange ideas about how he wanted to reshape society. Um, so there's a lot of that in this adventure too. So we just traded out Walt Disney for Lex Luthor, and Lex Luthor kidnapped Mr. Freeze because I had this idea for the old '80s Lex Luthor power armor, except it has like a Mr. Freeze kind of a glass helmet thing on the top. And I had done artwork of it and it looked really nice too. And then of course it's this green and purple armor, and so then I had colored the helmet thing in like a shade of light blue, and I shaded Luther's face where it was very bluish, and so then you had all three of the cool colors, green, blue, and purple. It just really popped. It really worked. And but yeah, this was the team that took on Luthor. And Matrix, one of the things he had figured out at this point was he didn't have to steal your powers, he could just duplicate them from like touching you. So he would shake hands with everybody when he met them, and they still kept their powers, but now he could do whatever they could do as well. And so he had met the Superboy from the 80s and had copied his powers. So he was using those abilities to fight Luthor, and then these guys were also fighting Lex Luthor. Um, that adventure went over really well. They defeated him. They managed to lock Luthor up at the end. Now, of course, now he needs a special jail cell, just like Freeze needs to keep him cool. Um, feel like I'm overlooking something. I don't know. But it was a really fun series of games. We played it around maybe like late 95, early 96, somewhere in there. But it was very cool. Everybody had a really good time, and pretty much all of my players who were playing during that time period, for them, they feel like that was their favorite era of the game, like ever. That the stuff we've done since then doesn't quite grab them as much as the new Continuum games did. And it was really pretty traditional superhero storytelling, you know. Which I guess is why there aren't too many things that are jumping out at me as being out of the ordinary and worth mentioning. But yeah. So as we're going through the timeline of our game world, I wanted to be sure to mention this. Hopefully you enjoyed hearing about it. If so, as always, we would love it if you took a brief moment of your time to smash that like button, check to see if you're still subscribed, and as always, leave us a comment. We love hearing from you guys. So, from everybody here associated with the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure. Bye.